Look, I think a lot of these election law changes are the product of cynicism. Politicians who know that they can't defend the changes through a slow, methodical process, rushing them through with the other political players who also have something to gain.
Who also benefit.
Exactly.
One for mum, one for dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains economics, politics and policy in plain English. I'm your host, Ebony Bennett. It went under the radar amid a global oil crisis and all the pre-budget speculation, but a recent High Court ruling could have big implications for Australian democracy. With a state election approaching, the court found that a loophole in Victoria's political donation laws was unconstitutional and voided the laws. That means Victoria has no donation laws in place ahead of the state's election in this coming November, leaving the Parliament little time to draft new legislation. But with South Australian and federal legislation containing quite similar loopholes, the impact of this ruling could be felt well beyond Victoria. Joining me to discuss what this means is Australia Institute Director of Democracy and Accountability, Bill Brown. G'day, Bill.
Hey,
So, Bill, let's talk about this court case. The court ruled that Victoria's nominated entity loophole was unconstitutional, but I have no idea what that is or what it refers to. What is it and why did the court strike it down?
So the starting point is that Victoria brought in a cap on political donations. You can't give more than $5,000 to a party or candidate every 4 years.
Sounds reasonable.
The nominated entity exception said that if you got in early enough, you could choose a foundation or an investment arm of the political party or an asset holding body that isn't subject to the donation cap. So they can give you in excess, sometimes well in excess of $5,000.
Yep.
The court says, look, under the Constitution of Australia, if you're going to restrict people's political communication, and that includes spending money, then you have to do so in a reasonable and proportionate way. It might be reasonable to cap donations, but it's not reasonable to cap donations and give yourself a loophole.
A get out of jail free card.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's that sense where it's not applying equally to everyone that's the problem here.
The case today is really about fairness.
The drift away from the major parties is because people are dissatisfied with their policies and their performance and they don't trust them. This won't help.
We've heard from the people that we are trying to represent that they want us to do a good job for them. What we don't need is a rigged set of donation laws and a system that unfairly biases the major parties.
Make better policies. Don't make bad laws.
Tell us why that's a problem. Who was going to be using those loopholes and why did the court find that was so uneven?
So there was a 2-year window after the donation cap was legislated where you could choose pretty broadly who you wanted your nominated entity to be. Then the rules became much stricter. Basically, if you wanted a nominated entity after that point, you had to start from scratch, and that entity would also be subject to the donation cap.
Okay.
So we know that the 3 major parties, Labor, Liberal and the Nationals, all got in before that deadline, and they chose bodies that might have, in one case, in excess of $100 million in assets stored up.
So everyone else, you can only donate up to $5,000, but there's this whole thing over here with over $100 million and they've got no caps.
Exactly right.
Okay. So much better for the established major parties, not so much if you're a new party, minor party or independents. Would that be roughly right?
Exactly right.
Okay. So, Bill, the court found against this, struck out this legislation, and now Victoria's got no political donation laws whatsoever.
So that's one angle that I don't think anyone was quite expecting. the High Court looked at the Victorian laws, and although it was only interested in one particular loophole in one particular section, it felt that it would be overstepping the role of a court to try to fiddle around with the legislation itself. It said the cleanest thing to do here is to strike out the whole section because the Parliament might get together and might find a few different options for how to solve this unfairness.
So effectively, the court was like, back to the drawing board, Parliament?
Exactly.
Okay.
And that means no donation disclosure laws, so all the money coming in is secret. It means foreign donations are allowed again. It means the taxpayer funding of the political parties has stopped just before they get the last instalment of money. It means that the donation cap as a whole, not just this loophole section, does not currently apply.
Yeah. And so, Bill, the Australia Institute has done a huge amount of research on electoral reforms. And I know that you looked at the 2018 electoral law changes in Victoria. Was this loophole effectively that the court has ruled against the only problem with the laws that Victoria passed?
Not even close. Actually, when I look back at my writing of this is one bullet point as an example of a loophole. Other examples include that donations from candidates aren't capped. So they didn't even solve the Clive Palmer problem here because he's often run as a candidate himself. The tithe or levy that political parties charge their MPs and staff also isn't capped. Membership fees aren't capped. So there's one enterprising party that at the last election had a special $250,000 membership tier.
A lot of people taking that up?
Only one, surprisingly. And that's before we get to things like the fact that the major parties don't depend on private donations because they get so much taxpayer funding.
Mm-hmm.
That's also unfair.
Yeah. So can you just explain that in a little more detail, Bill? Because I think for a lot of people listening, the idea of publicly funded elections rather than privately funded elections, it just, on the face of it, sounds quite sensible. What are some of the issues that have arisen where we've tried to move more towards a publicly funded election model and some of the issues that that's raised when done poorly?
So the problems with Australia's public funding or taxpayer funding systems really come back to the fact that you only get the money after you've already achieved the election result. So the classic form, it exists federally, exists in Victoria, is that for every vote you receive, you might get $5, for example. That adds up over millions of votes. You can't win those votes until you've already run in an election. Someone who's starting out from scratch needs the private money in order to fund a campaign, in order to get the public money. The other model that we have is administrative funding. It says a political party, instead of fundraising among private donors to cover the costs of administration, gets payment from the government. But it gets that payment in proportion to the number of members of parliament that it has. So you have a particularly good election, suddenly you've got this gold-plated political party structure, even though your membership might have stayed the same.
Yeah.
And again, someone starting up a new political party doesn't get any of that money to get going.
So it's all essentially weighted towards people who are already in Parliament, political parties that are already in Parliament, people with incumbency. And if you're new or starting out or you want to start a new political party, you're stuffed, basically.
That's right. And there are ways to do fair taxpayer funding. So in the city of Seattle, they give every voter democracy vouchers that can be traded in by new candidates as well as established candidates. That's a way of putting the power in the hands of voters and allowing them to decide who gets the money.
The major parties control the parliament and can, when it's in their interest, join together to try and create an unlevel playing field and lock out competitors.
You shouldn't have to be sponsored by a billionaire in order to have a chance of getting into the Australian Parliament.
But you could swamp, their argument is you could swamp an independent in their seat.
Look.
They're worrying you're cutting them off at the knees, basically.
Look, can I say a couple of things? If an independent can't get their message out with an $800,000 spend, then maybe they shouldn't be in the game.
At the end of the day, the Australian people should see their will reflected in the people that they vote for and they choose to put in the parliament, and that will should not be subverted by the major parties who are using their power to implement legislation that is unfair and to shut not only independents out, but to therefore shut out the will of the Australian people.
So Victoria's not the only jurisdiction that's changed its electoral laws in recent years. South Australia and, as you mentioned, the federal government have also done this. This High Court ruling, is it expected to impact on other jurisdictions' electoral laws?
I think it certainly puts them on notice. So South Australia and federally, they brought in nominated entity provisions, the types of thing that were the subject of this High Court challenge.
Mm-hmm.
So you can imagine people would be looking there for starters. Now, the way that they implemented those nominated entities is different to how it was done in Victoria. So there's certainly no guarantee that that form of nominated entity would be unconstitutional, but it certainly gets you asking questions.
Yeah.
And similarly, in those jurisdictions, there are examples of unfair treatment where an independent gets a very strict spending cap and a political party gets several ways of working around what appears to be the same spending cap.
And I know you've looked at that in detail at the federal level. Can you just explain that in a bit more detail for someone who's not across this as you? So we've seen in recent years more and more independents elected to Parliament. If we're applying these new laws going forward, is that less likely because of these electoral law funding arrangements?
It certainly gets harder for them.
Yeah.
So what we see is that the law says that you can spend $800,000 in a particular seat. Now, an independent, they're only running in one seat, so all their spending counts towards that cap.
Yep.
But a political party has the option of advertising to promote the party as a whole with material that doesn't mention the seat that they're targeting. So in effect, they can spend beyond that $800,000 cap. And similarly, we see things where political parties will pile in their spending in target seats. On average, their spending may not look that high, but that's because they have a bunch of safe seats where they don't need to spend a lot of money.
Yeah, okay. So part of the justification, if I recall at the time, for the federal changes was this concern that independent candidates, I think probably specifically Clive Palmer at the time that they were first mooted, but were splashing huge amounts of cash around in their election campaigns. But as he said, does that claim stack up? Is there lots of Clive Palmer independent problems kind of skewing things? What does the data actually show?
So Clive Palmer is unprecedented in that he spends major party sums of money for micro-party election results.
Yeah.
And certainly the Australia Institute has suggested ways that you could limit his political involvement to something more proportional without interfering in the whole funding system.
Yeah.
But the other main complaint is against the community independents, or they call them TEALs sometimes, who did in some cases spend over $1 million for a single seat. But that only seems unprecedented to us because of the way that independents have to report their spending.
Mm-hmm.
We know that the major political parties have also spent over $1 million in seats from time to time.
Yeah.
But their disclosures are mostly in the form of overall state or national figures, where those target seat campaigns are disguised by the other smaller campaigns.
So it could be that major parties are also spending up over $1 million in, for example, marginal seats, but that's just invisible in their returns.
That's right. And we know from kind of reports of particular seat campaigns that does happen. What we don't get is any kind of picture of how widespread it is, what the actual distribution of spending looks like.
And so Victoria's about to go back to the drawing board. I'll ask you what happens next. But before I do that, what should be the guiding principle for these kinds of electoral reforms and the criticisms that you've had where they don't stack up now? What should the guiding principle be for Victoria as it goes back to redraft its legislation?
I think a few elements are there. The first is to involve the public. One of the things we've seen with most of these changes is that they rush them through without a lot of scrutiny. And that's partly because most of the public don't know to what extent they fund political parties and political candidates. In fact, the focus on political donations disguises the role of the taxpayer in campaigning. And if you actually went back to the public and asked them, given that you are the majority funder for this political party, is its governance stacking up? Is its constitution stacking up? Is its internal democracy stacking up? You might get a very different answer. Similarly, the parliament needs to be more involved. Both in South Australia and federally, the upper house neglected its role as a house of review. It didn't hold an inquiry into the changes that would have revealed some of the same vulnerabilities that we're now seeing emerge in Victoria. And similarly, taking your time. We see that governments push through a particular piece of legislation. They might negotiate major changes behind closed doors, and then the next version pops up and goes through the parliament thanks to some behind-the-scenes deal.
Yeah.
That happened in South Australia. It happened federally.
Okay. I mean, it's not unusual for the major parties to kind of get together and make an agreement behind closed doors. On occasions, it happens with minor parties as well. But do you think there's an argument that where, in particular, Parliament is aiming to change the rules of the game for, like, political parties? Surely it's even more important that that goes through, as you say, some kind of public process.
Yes, so in politics, the winning team gets to change the rules of the game, and there's no equivalent of that on the sporting field. I think it's exactly right that when it comes to changes to political donation laws or the way that elections are conducted, a government can pull the ladder up behind themselves and deny other people the advantages that they received the first time around. And political cynicism doesn't always pay off. We've seen, for example, that switching between full preferential voting and optional preferential voting as a way to lock out the left or the right often coincides with a surge in support for One Nation at exactly when Labor thought it would benefit them, or a surge in support for the Greens exactly when the coalition thought it would benefit them.
Yeah.
And so in practice, it's better to make these rules on a principled basis because in the long term, everyone's going to benefit from a fairer political system.
I guess you've hit the nail on the head there, Bill. That kind of seems like the crux of the situation. The public is really interested in more transparency. I think they're genuinely concerned about the malign influence of political donations to political parties. But that's something that is invisible to the public, really, as you were saying, where they actually get the majority of their funding from. So how important is it, do you think, that the public understands that the role of political donations from outside in our electoral system?
I think it's really something that people haven't grappled with yet in any kind of full capacity. If we think about publicly funded institutions, it might be art galleries or museums, schools and hospitals. It's not the political parties. And to some extent, that reflects the changing role of political parties in our system. They used to be these mass movements that attracted a relatively large share of the population as members. In population terms, relative to Australia's growth, political party membership has at best stagnated. And so these parties are increasingly separated from the body politic that they're meant to represent. And taxpayer funding has really come in as something of a substitute for those deeper and more nuanced connections that they used to have with the community. I think grappling with political funding, it requires looking at the different ways that corporations exercise influence. A political donation is rarely the limit of a corporation's interference with our political system. And even if you look at some of the big corporate victories in the past, like the overturning of the mining tax, the industry's campaign outnumbered their political donations several times over. It was their power to act directly that caused such problems with the Rudd Prime Ministership and the Labor Party. And so to focus on political donations and to neglect the rest of the ecosystem means making mistakes like this. It means an undue focus on a less significant element of corporate influence.
Yeah. So, where does that leave Victoria specifically? Is it likely they will get legislation up before the state election?
So I think it's likely we get something. All the incumbents have an incentive to get that taxpayer funding spigot turned back on. And of course, there's a strong moral case for getting transparency laws back in place and making them retrospective so that we find out who's actually been funding the political parties and what they might be interested in receiving in response for their donations.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a live question whether they also bring back donation caps. And if so, do they try and get some alternative form of nominated entity implemented as well? Or do they try for a donation cap that has fewer or no loopholes to work around? There's also a question of who they do the deal with. So the Labor government's really dragged its heels. An independent expert review warned them in 2023 that there were problems with nominated entities. And we still haven't heard what the government's solution is well over a month on from the High Court decision now. They might work with the Liberals, but the Liberals have concerns about the donation cap. They might work with the Greens. The Greens have their own concerns. And with the election in November, the June sitting, so next month's sitting, is probably one of the last windows they have to get something through, if they get anything through at all.
Yeah, okay. So, Bill, I just want to end on your reflections, I guess, because as you've said, Victoria, this will have lots of implications potentially, not just for Victoria, but potentially beyond. But surely this is kind of the worst case scenario, heading into a state election, no legislation in place, overturned by the courts for very good reason, and that now having to go back and do it all again. It seems a pretty ass-backwards way to do things. What do you hope moving forward that the lessons are learned from this?
Look, I think a lot of these election law changes are the product of cynicism. Politicians who know that they can't defend the changes through a slow, methodical process, rushing them through with the other political players who also have something to gain.
Who also benefit.
Exactly. So I'd like to see more open processes in future. And doing so and having a solid evidence base for action and consulting properly might well help defend future laws against constitutional challenge, because the government can explain itself. It can say, well, this is a proportionate response to the problem because we talked to a bunch of experts, we consulted Australians, and they told us that these problems exist. If I leave listeners with a thought, it's to have a particular skepticism about proposals to limit political donations. Because although we talk a lot about the compromising donations that major parties receive, they are not, for the most part, funded by those kinds of donations. They receive large amounts of taxpayer funding, they have incumbency advantages, they have accumulated assets. So they have a perverse incentive to limit the role of political donations in the electoral system.
Well, thanks for joining us, Bill.
Thanks a lot, Eb.
This episode was recorded on Tuesday, the 19th of May, and some things may have changed since recording. If you want to read more from our researchers about Australia's democracy and accountability and much, much more, check out thepoint.com.au. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm your host, Ebony Bennett. Thanks for listening.